Good evening, everyone. As you can see, I'm not Margaret Cousins, the chairperson of Initiatives of Change. I'm standing in on her behalf. I'm Mike Kane. I'm the Member of Parliament for Wythenshawe and Sale East, and I'm a trustee of Initiatives for Change. And it's my great privilege to welcome you here on behalf of the trustees and the chair to tonight's event, Israel Palestine in Search of Truth and Justice. Margaret is currently in Perth, Australia. So if you don't mind, if everybody can face this camera here and just give her a little wave and say hello, Margaret, because she's watching. Ready? Yeah. After three, 1, 2, 3. Hello, Margaret. Great, thank you. Everybody for that. We have a full room in the house tonight, which is absolutely fantastic, and we have hundreds more, over 200 people online joining us this evening. Unfortunately, I have a vote in the House of Commons at 7 o'clock, so I can't be with you to the end. I'm afraid we have the Rwanda policy is rearing its I was nearly about to say ugly head, but I best not, just in case, this evening. And we have 2 more days of it next week as well. So Philip Babaya is here, who is the former chair and of trustees for Initiatives for Change. So he may have to step in towards the end. It's a bit like the Hotel California, Philip. You can check in, but you can never check out of this organisation, I find. Right. I had the great privilege of being in Palestine, Israel in 2012 on a pilgrimage. I'm a Catholic, and I got to see many of the sites. I played my flute in the Manger Church and football with the locals on Manger Square. I saw the wall. I went to Ramallah. I saw where Christ went out into the desert and all that. And then to Jerusalem, where I met an Hasidic Jew at the wall when I went to the Wailing Wall. And he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "England." And he said, "Which bit?" I said, "Manchester." He said, "Which bit?" I said, "Wythenshawe. Are you a City or a United fan?" Which then led to a huge discussion, which is my abiding memory. And I also remember meeting the Muslim family who hold the keys to the Holy Sepulchre Church, which is an incredible story, really. And the keys of this church have been in the hands of this Muslim family for over 1,000 years at least. And he has a card, and he greets you at the door, this Muslim man. And during British rule, the general invited the Christian factions in, and I still remember this story, to say, "What can I do to improve your lives here in the holy city of Jerusalem?" And they said, "We want the key to the Holy Sepulchre." And he went, "Well, that's easy enough, isn't it, to sort out?" So the general asked the Muslim man to hand over the keys, at which point the 5 factions of Christians started fighting for the keys, at which point they handed the key back to the Muslim family who've looked after the Holy Sepulchre all these years. Now, Initiatives of Change, our charity, is committed to a fundamental mission, building trust across the world's divide. We seek to create spaces in which dialogue can take place between different groups of people, including and especially groups which have historically misunderstood each other. The ultimate objective of all our work is to promote sustainable reconciliation and lasting peace. The need for peace in Israel and Palestine is particularly acute, as you're well aware, in the current political climate. Trust between communities in the region has collapsed in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. And numerous Israeli officials have expressed their opposition now to a 2-state solution and sovereignty for people in Gaza. While Hamas leaders, as we know, have pledged to repeat the terrorism that we saw, whenever the opportunity presents itself, they wish to do it. In the face of such a situation, where there's such little compromise, where it seems more likely that violence and animosity will escalate rather than diminish, it is incumbent on us to consider the roots of this tragedy, what we can learn from history, and how we can act to create peace and justice. Initiatives of Change is a charity with a spiritual object, and Scripture often gives some of the ways to respond to mutual hatred and suspicion and mistrust. During his lifetime, Christ exhorted his followers to love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and to do good to those who hate you. In the Sermon on the Mount, he also recommended to them that if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Forgiveness lies at the heart of both these messages, of course, but at the same time, so does the idea that forgiveness requires personal responsibility, looking inward and discerning what each of us must do before bridges can be built with others. It is an idea that we at Initiatives of Change wholeheartedly support as we encourage individuals to be the change they wish to see in the world. It is also one which may help us to approach the difficult questions of truth and justice which surround the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is the same approach with Dr Peter Shambrook has applied with such moral incision and clarity in his book, Policy of Deceit. By looking to history, it illustrates the extent to which the tragedy currently unfolding in the Middle East is the responsibility of all our nations. The culmination of a life's work spent studying the years between the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 is a thought-provoking, incredibly well-researched contribution to the debate about where we are and where we want to go. Peter has also written extensively about French imperialism in the Middle East and has held research positions at the Centre for Lebanese Studies in Oxford and at Durham University. At a recent meeting in my local constituency, I was asked about the issues of 1948 and the creation of Israel and Palestine. I said, I'm just a council house kid from Wythenshawe. I am not academic at all. But we ended up in a discussion about, way before that, about Abraham and his wife Sarah and his servant Hagar and the children Ishmael and Isaac and the expulsion to the desert. So we know we have a millennia-old conflict here that we're not going to solve here tonight, but we're going to have the discussion about it. So we're honoured to welcome him tonight, as we are to welcome Sir Vincent Fean and Mike Scott-Baumann from the Balfour Project, about which we will hear more in due course. I hope you're all looking forward to learning from our speakers and thinking through the complex issues and questions which they will raise. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an entrenched conflict. Many people at the time of war run to their corners and spout the rhetoric that they are used of and that they are comfortable with. We have to avoid that tonight. We are here to engage. We all exist on a timeline of selflessness to selfishness, and the Holy Spirit acts where we come together. So I implore all this evening, no matter what your thoughts and where you are on this conflict, that we engage fully. So please give a wholehearted welcome now to Dr. Peter Shambrook.
First of all, a big thanks to Initiatives of Change for inviting me for this occasion. Every writer has their own story, which informs their worldview and their writing to one degree or another. We all have our stories. My worldview has been marked and shaped principally by three factors: my parents, my 20-year association with the Fellowship of Moral Rearmament, extensive visits made, and friendships built. My father, thoroughly English, quiet, a man of profound integrity, who encouraged me to keep my word, and a man with an amazing war record, World War II record, a record which, like many of his generation, he spoke about with great reluctance. My mother, an immigrant from Republican Catholic Ireland, daughter of a lighthouse keeper, bright, big-hearted, gracious, and forensic when describing the history of the English in Ireland. So I had the thoroughly confusing privilege of growing up as an English Catholic lad near Manchester during the 1950s, attempting quite unsuccessfully to absorb and reconcile the joys and pains of two completely incompatible 500-year-old national narratives. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Fellowship of Moral Rearmament, MRA, what initiatives of change is now called, introduced me to MRA introduced me to the idea of global change, starting with personal change, what I call the global ideology of conscience, and to the practice of listening daily to the inner voice for inspiration and direction. The fellowship also introduced me to the Middle East, with visits, deep friendships made, and an introduction to the delights and challenges of classical Arabic. I owe more than I can say to my parents, and it must be said, I owe a great deal to the Fellowship of Moral Rearmament. Over the decades since, some years of academic research, and more importantly, visits to Bergen-Belsen, Dresden, Berlin, Verdun, Arromanches in Normandy, Cork, Derry, Londonderry, and to Skibbereen in the southwest of Ireland have all shaped my worldview and my writing, in particular in this book. Such places, as I've just mentioned, what I call universal spaces, do provide the opportunity for profound reflection about human nature, human behavior, and the lessons of history. Some writers of history, certainly historians or some historians of the modern Middle East, have specific agendas and ideologies. Some manage to cover their tracks quite successfully. On the recent history and historiography of Palestine-Israel, truth is therefore a formidably elusive quarry to track down and to attempt to describe, as I discovered afresh some 7 years ago as I began to dig into the official records in the UK's National Archives. Now, what have events in Gaza to do with us British? Well, the answer is a lot, perhaps even everything. We British started the 100-Year War for the control of Palestine. We all need to beware of the trap of simply framing the conflict as historically just one between Zionist settlers and Palestinians, or Israelis and Palestinians. That perspective is basically false. Of course, there is a national conflict there. It is central to the issue, but without the support, political, military, economic, and diplomatic of the British for the Zionist program following the First World War, none of what has happened over the past 100 years would have happened in the way it has. British and later US support were absolutely essential to the success of the Zionist project from the very beginning. So it is, I would suggest, more accurate to frame the 100-year struggle for Palestine as a triangular affair. And it must be said that political Zionism did not emerge out of a vacuum. The late 19th century transformation of cultural and spiritual Zionism into political Zionism, namely Jewish nationalism, was an understandable reaction to centuries of European, Christian, racial and religious intolerance and pogroms. In Russian, pogroms means devastation. British forces occupied Ottoman Arab Palestine in 1918 and stayed for 30 troubled years. During the First World War, as is well known, the British made a series of promises to their allies and potential allies. Negotiating and trading other territories and empires was standard great power diplomacy, a well-polished tradition for at least 200 years. We first promised the Ottoman Palestine region to the French, our allies the French, in early 1915, and then to the Arabs in the person of Sharif Hussein of Mecca in October 1915, and then 2 years later, we promised the same region of Palestine to the global Jewish community. After the war, for our own imperial reasons, we reneged on our promise to the Arabs and we fulfilled our promise to the Zionist organization. Successive post-World War I British governments then provided in Palestine and for Palestine the political, diplomatic, and military shield of bayonets throughout most, but not all, of the mandate period. That's 1922 to 1948, which enabled the Zionist dream of a Jewish state with a Jewish majority to become a reality. Now, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, which was mostly 1915, is a particularly intriguing promise. The promise was made in the form of an exchange of letters, 10 in all, and all conducted in Arabic, between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Cairo, acting on behalf of the British government, and Sharif Hussein. In return for the Arabs rising against the Ottomans, the British promised to support an extensive, very extensive, independent Arab state, including Palestine. It did not include Lebanon, or the Lebanon region, which McMahon excluded in deference to Britain's French ally. So the map, please. The map, please. Thanks, Joseph. Right, just one very quick map. This is the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey in the north. And so you have Beirut here, and the Lebanon region. Palestine is down here, of course. This is Jerusalem, Haifa, Aqaba, Amman, and this is basically the Ottoman administrative. Excuse me, sorry, the Ottoman administrative divisions. So let me just explain again. That is the Lebanon area, and to the south, you have Palestine, mandated Palestine. Since that promise made in 1915, successive British governments and pro-Zionist historians have maintained that Palestine, the Palestine region, was excluded from the promise to Sharif Hussein. And the Arab world has consistently argued since 1920 that Palestine was included in the correspondence. Well, was this important at the time? Well, the contemporary Foreign Office records show that the steadfast refusal of successive British governments between 1920 and 1939 to publish this promise, to publish the correspondence, and there were 24 official refusals in the House of Commons during this period. And this refusal to publish clearly soured Anglo-Arab relations during the 1920s and the 1930s. My book demonstrates conclusively, I claim, that Palestine was included in the promise to the Sharif, and that British governments have lied all along. The evidence, both textual and contextual, is overwhelming. This from the evidence of thousands of government official documents of the period and the private papers of some of the officials involved. In the National Archives at Kew, I found myself reading hundreds of Colonial Office, Foreign Office, Cabinet Office records, and this was before COVID, fortunately. So I found myself, I took 10,000 photos of documents, relevant documents, during the 1920s and 1930s. So in one hand, I had what the Colonial Office were saying to themselves and the advice that they were giving to 10 Downing Street from time to time. And in my other hand, I had the contemporary Hansard records, the Hansard records, parliamentary records, they're online. And I spent 6 months going through online the Hansard records. I went through every single day of Hansard, from June 1916 all the way through to December 1939. And I pulled out and I printed every question, every debate about Palestine during that period. It comes to almost 1.5 million words. And I printed it out and I compared the relevant stuff day by day, month by month, between what they were saying privately, what they were saying publicly, and the discrepancy, let me just say, was consistently pretty large in terms of the narratives being told. Okay. The Foreign Office records show, in fact, that between 1915, which was the time of the correspondence, and 1920, British officials, diplomatic and military, interpreted the correspondence correctly, in that McMahon, the High Commissioner, had only excluded the Lebanon area, not Palestine, from the promise to the Sharif. Government policy and the interpretation of the correspondence changed following the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Lord George, Prime Minister Lord George, and his colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, publicly maintained that Palestine was excluded from the area promised to Sharif Hussein. In the correspondence, they claimed, the reference to the district of Damascus could only mean the province of Damascus, which would thus exclude Palestine from the promise to the Sharif. In fact, a province of Damascus did not exist. In order to invent a province of Damascus, the Foreign Office literally redrew one of the Ottoman administrative boundaries. The new boundary was a total invention, a fiction which Lord George's pro-Zionist government adopted and which Churchill confirmed in his 1922 white paper. I have the map up here because just to show you the exact invented boundary, 300-mile boundary of the so-called province of Damascus is from Damascus here. It's the thick line going all the way down this way through the Dead Sea, 300 miles down to the Gulf of Aqaba. There was never any province of Damascus. This whole area from Aqaba all the way through to almost to Aleppo is and was called the province of Syria. So back to the British Mandate document ratified by the League of Nations in 1922 contained a fundamental contradiction. in that it advocated both the establishment of a Jewish national home and, at the same time, instructed the mandatory power, Britain, to prepare Palestine for self-government. However, from the start, Lord George's government instituted a pro-Zionist, anti-Arab policy. The truth concerning Britain's policies implemented in Palestine was described in 2011 in a speech in Israel by no less than Sir Martin Gilbert, the late Sir Martin Gilbert, Churchill's official biographer and a prolific Zionist historian. And I quote, "The centerpiece of British mandatory policy was the withholding of representative institutions for as long as there was in Palestine an Arab majority." End of quote. This sentence, in my view, is the key to understanding all the other policies that Britain used to govern Palestine up to 1948. In July 1920, when the first civilian High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, arrived in Palestine, and Samuel was, of course, British, Jewish, and a committed Zionist, he immediately established and presided over a Crown colony-style government administration, an inflexible dictatorship, and arbitrarily passed hundreds of laws during his 5-year rule in Palestine. These included laws, they were called ordinances, which, one, specifically and deliberately encouraged Jewish immigration, two, opened the land registration system to foreigners, three, recognized officially the Jewish Constituent Assembly, four, denied recognition of the Palestinian Arab Executive, and five, established Hebrew as an official language of Palestine alongside English and Arabic. At that time, the percentage of the population of Palestine who spoke Hebrew as their mother tongue was 2%. In other words, Samuel did everything to encourage the growth of a Jewish national entity, political, economic, and demographic in Palestine. Moreover, British mendacity became a hallmark of its rule for the next 30 years. Just let me explain this. The history of international relations over the last 200 years demonstrates what I call, demonstrates that concealed intentions, hidden agendas, is a standard feature, among others, a standard feature of all great power diplomacy. Let me give you 5 brief, specific examples concerning Palestine. There are a score or more of examples in my book, but here are 5. 1, in 1919, the Conservative leader of the House of Commons, Andrew Bonar Law, assured the House that the government would encourage the growth of local government and institutions in Palestine. It was a lie. 2, in 1922, in Churchill's White Paper on Palestine, he claimed that Palestine was excluded from the promise to the Sharif. He also claimed that the government intended to foster some measure of self-government in Palestine. That was a lie. 3, in 1922, in Lord Balfour's maiden speech in the House of Lords, he stated that the political rights of Palestinians were fully safeguarded. It was a lie, and he knew it. 4, In 1923, the new colonial secretary, the Duke of Devonshire, stated in the House of Lords that, and I quote, "Every provision has been made by the government to prevent Palestine from becoming a Jewish state or under Jewish domination." That was a lie. Finally, in 1939, the British government still officially maintained that Palestine was excluded from the promise to the Sharif, although the Colonial Office records clearly show they knew the truth. A truth which has never been acknowledged by any subsequent government. My book reveals in detail the truth of this matter and calls for an official acknowledgement of this 100-year cover-up. In the mid-1930s, two factors exploded onto the Palestinian scene. One was the tremendous increase of Jewish immigrants into Palestine who were fleeing Nazi persecution. Hitler had come to power 2 years earlier. And this fundamentally changed the demographic balance between the Jewish and the Arab communities. In 1935, some 62,000 Jews arrived in Palestine. More Jews arrived in Palestine in that year, in 1935, than the total number of Jews living in Palestine during the First World War. The second factor to explode onto the Palestinian scene was the Palestinian revolt, the Arab revolt, which started in 1936, precipitated largely by the British steadfast refusal for the previous 15 years to allow any constitutional development at all in Palestine. This in spite of a series of Arab delegations, Palestinian delegations to London, numerous petitions and peaceful demonstrations. And of course, the British total refusal to limit Jewish immigration. So Palestinians became increasingly fearful of being swamped. In order to suppress the Arab revolt, the Palestinian revolt, the British passed emergency regulations which legalized mass arrests, curfews, house demolitions, and military courts. Waterboarding of prisoners was not uncommon. Waterboarding did not start in Iraq 20 years ago. By the summer of 1939, the revolt had been brutally suppressed, the Palestinian people disarmed, their leaders exiled or executed. Around 108 or 109 Palestinians were hung by the British between 1937 and 1939, and the Jewish militias had been armed and trained by the British. Between 1920 and 1939, on 24 separate occasions, successive governments had refused requests in the House of Commons to publish the correspondence, which would have revealed the promise of Palestine to the Sharif. In 1939, with a global war on the horizon, the UK government was keen to keep the Arab world, the Islamic world, on side. It needed to pacify Palestine in order to release troops to protect Egypt and the Suez Canal. So, very reluctantly, it agreed to an official Anglo-Arab investigation, a kind of committee, of the correspondence. Nevertheless, in the committee's report, the joint report of March 1939, Chamberlain's government still maintained the lie that Sharif Hussein had not been promised to the Palestine region in 1915. I would claim that Palestine was lost to the Zionist political militia leadership by 1939. In other words, before the Second World War started and before the Holocaust. In 1948, the British government, exhausted by the war, washed its hands, like Pontius Pilate, of the Palestine problem. It withdrew and allowed Zionist militias in effect to mount a coup and to drive a majority of Palestinians out of Palestine. In 1948, the indigenous Palestinian Arabs still constituted a solid majority, some 68% of the population, and still owned 93% of the land of mandatory Palestine. The Jewish community, now some 32% of the population and largely urban, owned some 7% of Palestine. In 1948, Ben-Gurion's Zionist militias created the State of Israel on 78% of Palestine. No British government has examined or acknowledged its predecessors' contradictory promises during World War I regarding Palestine, nor its deceitful mandate policies, which led inevitably to the destruction of Palestinian society and the conflict since then. No British government has ever expressed one iota of responsibility for what happened in 1948. And since 1967, a succession of governments in London, their eyes firmly fixed on the next election, on trade, on oil security, and on the so-called special relationship with Washington, D.C., have shown no desire whatsoever to hold Israel, a close ally, a self-proclaimed liberal democracy, to account for its un-Jewish, colonizing, brutal, oppressive policies, which therefore remain consequence-free. The war for Palestine started in Whitehall and 10 Downing Street during the First World War. The current nightmare in Gaza and the West Bank is a direct legacy of Britain's mendacious, one-sided, mandate period policies. Our current political leaders, who may or may not be informed, I don't know, about Britain's past role in Palestine, are currently complicit in collective punishment, ethnic cleansing, war crimes. I suspect that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer may or may not continue to pursue morally and politically indefensible policies until they absorb and decide to act upon balanced advice about Palestine and Israel. Justice, I believe, will prevail eventually, but at a huge cost. Just how huge, no one can predict. Currently, the situation is extremely bleak. I'll finish with 3 brief observations. First, Gaza is now the graveyard of some 25,000 souls, maybe more. The vast majority, innocent civilians, men, women, and children. Gaza is also the current global graveyard of international law. The US, the UK, Europe, and Israel speak about international law, but they take no notice of it. Second, Israel will never, ever have security while Palestinians have no security, no political rights, remain under siege, and see no viable future for themselves, for their children, or for their grandchildren. Lastly, I would underline that this is not a conventional war. It is an ethnic cleansing operation, an opportunity seized by Israel following the Hamas terror attack of the 7th of October. It will not destroy Hamas, although the asymmetry in power between the Hamas fighters and the IDF is indeed monumental. Eventually, not now, there's no space for it now, but eventually there will have to be meaningful, and I mean meaningful, negotiations towards a resolution of this brutal, seemingly intractable 100-year war. That would take statesmanship, of which at present there is no sign whatsoever. It may also need some very competent, courageous, and sensitive intermediaries. And the negotiations would require the inclusion of all parties, including Hamas, as Lord Peter Hain, our former Minister of State for the Middle East, wrote last week in The Guardian. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Peter. Thank you for ending on the words that we're going to need courageous leaders, intermediaries and all parties to come together. There was so much I agreed with of that speech, and there was some of it I didn't agree with as well. I think leaders act out of the common good most of the time. And to have read 1.5 million words of Hansard, well, that's more than I've done in my 10 years in Westminster. So that is impressive. But you did mention, I thought it was a slight joke as well about your mother being the daughter of Irish immigrants and the daughter of lighthouse keepers, and you described her as very bright. Was that an actual a play on words? But you mentioned the Good Friday Belfast agreements, and we think 500 years of conflict entrenched and the courageousness that took from both the major governments initially and then from the Blair government subsequently to bring that about with intermediaries and with leadership was a defining thing. And I think if anybody saw Have I Got News for You recently, Fergal Sharkey made a fantastic, eloquent display about if we can do it in Ireland, we can do it anywhere else on the planet. My votes are coming shortly, so I'm going to have to make an escape in a second and hand over to Philip, but it's my great pleasure now to introduce Mike Scott-Baumann, a graduate of the University of Cambridge. Mike taught history for 35 years and is the author of Palestinians and Israelis, A Short History of Conflict, which was published by the History Press in 2021. He is chair of the Executive Committee of the Balfour Project, an organisation which seeks to advance understanding of the plight facing Palestinians and Israelis by focusing particularly on Britain's role in the origins of violence in the region. So with that, please put your hands together for Mike.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you again, Peter. Your book really does prove quite conclusively that the British did promise Palestine to the Arabs, quite conclusively. Now, we've got 15 minutes for questions. I think we should let us keep the questions to the history. There'll be plenty of opportunity later to ask questions about the current situation in Gaza and West Bank. But we've got time for several questions. Let's keep them nice and short. Who would like to kick off? Yes, gentleman in green.
Thank you very much. Just need to speak into the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very nice presentation and the wonderful research which you did on the history of the Palestinian mandatory period. I want to ask a question about what were the main reasons for the British government to issue the Balfour Declaration? Thank you.
Should I answer that?
Please.
All the 4 or 5 promises to different parties made by the 2 successive British governments during the First World War, all of them were fundamentally to gain a strategic military edge over their enemies or their potential enemies. So there were 4 or 5 reasons for the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, and it's very well covered in many books. The Balfour Declaration was the end result of 18 months of intense negotiations between the British government and representatives of the Zionist organization in London. So, among other factors, one was the fact that America had come into the war in April 1917, and so Lord George, in particular, who was sort of pro-Zionist himself, he was very keen to help revive the flagging enthusiasm in America for the war. It was partly to do with loans as well, which were being held up in Congress, loans for the war effort. So Lord George had his eyes on Washington, D.C., and he had his eyes on Russia as well, to try and keep Russia into the war. Some of the leaders, new leaders like Lenin and others were Jewish, although in fact they weren't particularly Zionist, and so on. So, and Chaim Weizmann's role himself he was a very persuasive person. So there were 4 or 5 factors. I might say anti-Semitism was another issue, and racism. I mean, it is complicated, but just to make one point, Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, he had been Prime Minister in 1903, 1905, when there were increasing numbers of, in particular, Jewish refugees fleeing from the pogroms from the Russian Empire, and they were coming into Britain, and they were largely unwelcome. Let's put it like that. There were riots in the East End of London, and Balfour was the man in 1903 as Prime Minister who introduced the Aliens Bill, limiting what was largely Jewish immigrants into Britain at that time. And this was the first Aliens Bill. This was the first bill in the history of Westminster, 800 years of Westminster's, to restrict immigration like that. So, and when you read in between the lines of all these documents, basically, I think for some of the decision makers, they looked at the Jews, or sometimes what they called the Hebrews in their correspondence, as better over there than coming in here. Better to let's make a colony that will protect the Suez Canal. Let's have them over here, and then they won't be a political issue here. But you have to really sniff that out in between the lines of some of the documents and private papers. So, but yes, it was to win the war. Everything was to win the war.
Thank you very much, Peter. Gentleman at the front.
Richard Wright, I've used to work for UNRWA. I've also studied the 1930s, and I very much agree with your main conclusions. But one interesting thing that I've discovered, or I believe I've discovered in studying this period, which you've focused on, is, and it's still true today, and that is that the Palestinians are irrevocably divided. They never, ever managed to get together as one united people for political reasons or whatever. And this is very true in the 1930s. You referred to the uprising. There was 2 uprisings, in fact. But there was always division between the Palestinian groups. And this is exactly the same as the situation today. You have Hamas, you have the Palestinian Authority, they're not united, and the Israelis exploit the divide and, from classic divide and rule tactics. So, I mean, do you agree with this? There's this thread of continuity through history that the Palestinians just are never united, and it's cost them dearly.
And we would only expect you to speak on the 20s and 30s.
You're absolutely right that during the 30s there was division. The thing to remember, I think, is that it's a relatively, I wouldn't say minor, but it's the smaller factor compared to the British rock-solid decision not to allow any constitutional development in Palestine. That's the really key thing. And if you look in detail at what Samuel did, for instance, in creating the Supreme Muslim Council, he gave the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, that was their mouthpiece, that was their representation. But what that did, in fact, he did that for 2 reasons. He created the Muslim Supreme Council in some ways as an alternative to the possibility of a Palestinian National Council. And he also did it because it emphasized and it underlined the division between Musa Qasim al-Husseini and the man who he put in place as the head of the Muslim Council. They were cousins. So he exacerbated the difference between them. And that also underlined the whole British perspective that Palestine was made up of different religious communities. There was no national structure. And you have to look at all of Samuel's and the other High Commissioners and London's motives for maintaining that complete fiction that Palestine was made up of distinct, fighting, irreconcilable families and so on. There was division, of course there was, but the overall thing was the British, who were pretty clever at just keeping everybody as divided as possible.
Thank you. When I lived in Bangladesh, my Bengali friends would regularly remind me how good the British have been at divide and rule in Bengal, in Ireland, and they might have added in Palestine. But okay, gentleman in the middle there.
Thanks for your speech, and I just have a quick question. So, when Israelis or Jews settled in Palestine, how they did this? So, like, they bought a land, or was there any official thing? And is there any resistance or like conflict between Palestinians or like Israelis? Because at 1948, there was a huge land they owned, and
Yeah.
I don't know like the history that much. Yeah.
Up to about 1880, there had been a pretty continuous Jewish community in the region, so if you look at, if you just take 1880, the Jewish community was largely religious, very traditional, urban, and they lived in the 4 main towns of Palestine. I'm having senior moments here now, but I think it was Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron, I think, if I remember rightly. And they were Arabic speaking, and in many ways Arabic culture. Hebrew was their sort of religious language, but they were integrated as one of the minorities in the Ottoman. From the 1880s, because of the pogroms and the persecution of the Jewish community in what is now East and Central Europe, Russia, you had increasing numbers. You had a trickle, basically, to start with, of Jewish, Polish, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, all speaking different languages, some speaking a little bit of Hebrew and so on. And they came, and some of them started sort of socialist villages and things like this. Most of them were urban. So by the time of, and this trickle continued because the pogroms continued, it wasn't just one pogrom, up to the First World War. So at the time of the First World War, the Jewish community in Palestine was made up partly of the indigenous Arabic-speaking Jews, and then the sort of foreign Jews, the pioneers, who most of whom spoke Yiddish. Including Weizmann, spoke Yiddish. Ben-Gurion, who arrived from Poland in 1906, he obviously spoke Polish, and so at the time of the First World War, the Jews were about 7-8% of the population. No one knows exactly because there weren't accurate censuses at the time. But the Jewish community at the time of the First World War owned about 2% of the land. About 2% of the land. The idea that the Jews came and made the desert bloom and so on is largely a myth. It is largely a myth. It was Hitler's rise to power that really got things going. But the Jews, yes, the Jews did buy the land. They did buy the land, and some Arab big landowners sold land to the Jews, and the British facilitated that officially. The British authorities did. What's that?
There was no resistance.
There was resistance. In fact, there was resistance almost from the 1890s by various Palestinians and Palestinian families. But the British had bayonets. The Ottoman Empire had been defeated, and the British basically ran the show as they wanted to, so Lord George and Sir Herbert Samuel instituted this pro-Zionist policy, and of course the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization, really got going in they didn't have much money at the time, but they got going in America and were raising money. Money would be sent to Palestine to buy land. So, for instance, by 1948, when Israel was created, after 60 years of colonization, so to speak, Jewish colonization, Zionist colonization, the Jews owned still only 7% of the land area of Palestine, although they were now about a third of the population. This was in 1948 when the Nakba happened and the War of Independence, according to the Israelis. So that's the situation. But they did buy it. It never became a big political issue, the question of buying land in Palestine. The Palestinian leadership argued against it, but part of the problem was that some of the Palestinian leadership were secretly selling land to the Zionists. So this is a complicated story. It's not a simple black and white story.
Bearing out what the gentleman here was saying. I think we've only got time for one more, I'm afraid, and the gentleman in the middle there has had his hand up. Yes, please.
Thank you. Would you please say a word about the confusion or perhaps obfuscation between the Turkish Ottoman word vilayet, which we've seen on your map, and what I think is an Arabic word, wilayet, and the role that there was in that confusion between the two terms, and how the British used that confusion.
As quickly and as simply as you can, Peter.
Oh dear, oh dear. This is the heart of the matter in terms of the debate about whether Palestine was, and I managed to avoid it in my talk because it is somewhat complicated. I've explained it in my book. Vilayet was the Ottoman word for a province. Let's call it a province. You had very clear administrative boundaries in the Ottoman. And everybody had maps. The British had maps in Cairo. The Ottomans had maps. Everybody had maps in London, everywhere. And so it was very clear. The British knew what was a vilayet of Syria, and what a vilayet of Aleppo and a vilayet of Beirut was in that whole Eastern Mediterranean region. And the word in the correspondence in Arabic was wilaya. Now, wilaya translated into English means district, and in the English translation of the correspondence, they use the word district. They translated it into the word district. Now, the word district, even in English, has a variety of meanings. It can be a local district, a county district, or a large district, or whatever. So the British always maintained that the word wilaya in the Arabic of the correspondence meant the province of Damascus. Okay, that's what they said. This meant a province of Damascus, and the province of Damascus went all the way down. The key paragraph in McMahon's letter is, and it's all in my book, is he made an exclusion, and the exclusion was in this way. He said, McMahon said, you can have this whole area, which included most of Saudi Arabia, part of Iraq, everything, except for this area. And he described this area as being portions of Syria to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Al-Halab, Aleppo, must be reserved. Basically, he didn't say why, but it was for the French. Okay, so the word district, wilaya, it was actually wilayat. In Arabic, it's wilayat. So portions to the west were reserved. Now, the point is, in the linguistic, in that phrase, he talks about, in the same sentence, districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. Well, there was no vilayet or province of Homs or Hama. There was a province of Aleppo, but if you read the paragraph, it's quite clear. Any Arab would say this wilayat must be referring to city limits, because the other two towns mentioned in the same paragraph are not provinces. And even more funny or bizarre is if you look at this sentence and it says portions of Syria to the west of the province of Aleppo. If you take it as a province of Aleppo, the province of Aleppo, the western end of the province of Aleppo was the Mediterranean Sea. So, I mean, it was absolute nonsense for the British to allege that in the paragraph, the district of Damascus meant the province of Damascus. There was no province of Damascus. The whole region that went down southwards from Damascus was called, and everybody knew it, the province of Syria.
Thank you very much, Peter. And do continue your discussion with Peter if you wish at the end of the evening. But thank you very much for your questions. And thank you again, Peter, for your very full answers. Thank you.
Vincent Fean to the stage, please, from the Balfour Project, and also Philip Babayi.
Hello, yes, I'm Dr. Philip Bubaya, and sadly, of course, as you know, Mike Cain has had to leave to go to a vote in Parliament, so that's why there's a slight shuffling of the chairing on this event. So thank you so much, Peter, and what a rich set of things to reflect on and to think about in relation to British history and our legacy and so on. Now, I'd like to invite Sir Vincent Fean to come to the stage. Sir Vincent was a former ambassador in Libya, I believe 2006 to 10, and then Consul General in Jerusalem, 2010 to 14. So I think he is going to share his thoughts on perhaps the historical background and thoughts on the current situation. So, Sir Vincent.
Good evening. First of all, it's an honour to be on the same platform as Peter. My task is to say a few words about now. If we go back to the 7th of October, 1,200 Israelis killed. Today, 132 hostages still held by Hamas. As Peter said, 25,000 Palestinians killed, 70% of them women and children, roughly 250 a day. 72 journalists killed. Mr. Wright mentioned UNRWA, 142 plus UNRWA humanitarian workers killed. 22,000 strikes, airstrikes, land strikes by the Israeli armed forces in 3 months. 1.9 million people displaced. I came past a few rough sleepers tonight coming from Victoria, and I thought, there are many in Gaza now with a bit of plastic between them and the elements, and it's as cold there as it is here. 104 schools destroyed, 70% of the schools damaged, universities bombed. 23 of the 36 hospitals not usable. In the West Bank, a rough doubling of the number of Palestinians arrested over the years, doubled since the 7th of October to roughly 10,000 now. Of them, recently arrested 355 people under 18, children, and over 300 Palestinians killed in the West Bank. Going back to Gaza, we should listen to these people, the World Health Organization, Medical Aid for Palestinians, the UN, including UNRWA, talking about infectious diseases, because there has been starvation, the complete siege, and there is now diarrhea, you name it. That's where we are. It's ongoing. Blinken is in the region, which is good. US Secretary of State. David Cameron's been there and was giving evidence today to the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. This is the top issue in foreign affairs now, rightly so. I'm not here to defend Hamas, and I don't. I think what they did on the 7th of October was wrong. They are popular because they represent resistance. And negotiation with Netanyahu has not proved fruitful for the Palestinians. There needs to be democratic renewal in Palestine and reunification of Gaza and the West Bank. The Israeli government for decades has divided and ruled, such that Gazans have a great deal of difficulty meeting West Bankers, never mind intermarrying, which was the norm. So as Peter said, divide and rule has been the order of the day. That order needs to change because, again, as Peter said, Israel will not be safe until the Palestinians have security. And this cloak that Netanyahu has spread for decades, saying since about 1996, I can look after you, I can protect you, you don't have to worry about the Palestinians, I'll take care of them for you, has been debunked. That message needs to get through. There are a lot of honourable, caring Israelis. At the moment, there is much trauma. There's trauma in Israel, with about 250,000 people displaced from the south by the fighting around the kibbutzes and so on, and in the north by the fighting with Hezbollah. Much trauma, much focus on the hostages. The hostage families are the most powerful element in Israeli politics today. They want their people back at any price. In the Netanyahu government, there are Jewish supremacists, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who have a following and who are uttering words that should not be said about voluntary migration. Voluntary migration, just ponder that for a second. When you've got nowhere to go and you don't volunteer for what's happening to you. The Israeli ambassador here, I humbly say, is wrong to say that the Palestinians want to push us into the sea. The vast majority of Palestinians, I dare to say, acknowledge the existence of the State of Israel and want peace, coexistence, statehood, independence, side by side. Our own government tied itself rather too quickly to the Israeli fighting machine and has had trouble disentangling itself from it. So now they speak of a sustainable ceasefire. The Balfour Project speaks of a humanitarian ceasefire now. And let's see if it can be sustained. Our government has banned violent settlers who either incite or perpetrate violence in the West Bank. It's not enough. They don't want to come here. They want to do harm where they are. Tomorrow, our government is pushing through the House of Commons a bill which will do two things. Make it hard, if not impossible, for local authorities and universities to divest from settlements, and from Israel for that matter. It's called the Economic Activities of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill. It'll be voted on at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. I think Mike Cain will vote against. Labour and the SNP and the Lib Dems are against, but the government will whip it through, and then it's up to the House of Lords what happens next. But it's a bad bill, both in terms of timing and in terms of content. A brief word about the Balfour Project, and then I'll finish by saying what can we, and by we I mean UK civil society, do. What are we doing? Well, we're a relatively young charity since 2017. We're small. We work on education. Our aims are educational, awareness raising. Peter's book is a big contribution to that. Mike leads on educational work with teacher trainers, trying to increase and widen the study of this thorny subject at secondary school level. We have 15 or 20 postgraduate and undergraduate fellows who undertake projects with us for a very small amount of money. We try to promote international humanitarian law. Again, Peter was right to say it only has the teeth that nations want to give it. It's very selective. It shouldn't be. It is the framework, post-war framework, that we helped to negotiate after World War II, and which should be the kind of lodestar of what countries do. We seek to uphold it, and we ask our government to do so without fear or favour. We look at Gaza, but we also look at the West Bank. We have tried to bring the mayor of Masafa Yatta to the UK. His people are, for decades, living in that area of the South Hebron Hills. In 1980, Israel declared a firing range in that area and said the people who live there are trespassing. And the Supreme Court of Israel has endorsed that view. So they're under threat of eviction in the West Bank. We think about the word apartheid in the West Bank. There are reports by people of standing, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, an Israeli NGO, talking about apartheid. We think about recognition of the state of Palestine alongside Israel. 142 countries have done it. Ours hasn't. We bear a certain responsibility, as Peter's book says. We'll hold a conference in June of this year, the day before the anniversary of the Six-Day War. Can this tragedy be an opportunity? It's an ongoing tragedy. Can it be an opportunity to do things differently in the future? Can there be that reunification of Gaza and the West Bank? Can there be that recognition of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, which nobody can take away, but which Britain needs to facilitate rather than not? Last words about us, everybody. In the short term, make a noise. If you have money, give it to medical aid for Palestinians or one of the many bodies trying to do good, hampered by bombed out roads, lack of access through Rafah, many things. Support a humanitarian ceasefire now. There's been enough. There's been too much. Say nobody is above the law. Nobody should be. We have a general election. People will vote on the economy, on education, on migration, on jobs. Try to make this an issue at the hustings. Ask the candidates, what would you do if we voted for you? And try and make it clear that your vote might depend upon it, because that's when they listen. Talk about equality. Equality between Israelis and Palestinians. It isn't there. Talk about mutual security rather than unilaterally imposed security by one government of one people on another. I think that recognition issue matters. People vary on it. I think it matters. It has some legal implications. It also would begin to not remedy, but acknowledge our responsibility, which is not only past, it's present. Later this year, the International Court of Justice will decide or advise whether the occupation of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank is legal I don't think it is. 56 years for a temporary occupation is too long. Can that decision, if it goes that way, be the trigger for change? I hope so. I'll stop there. We can't let it go, this issue. It is too important to let go. Thank you.
Is this working now? Yes, good. I believe, Sir Vincent, that you're willing to take some questions. So perhaps the best for you to stay at that. Oh, stay seated. We're supposed to stay seated. Okay. Yep. Maybe who would like to ask Sir Vincent a question? You would, this gentleman here. Yep. You want to?
Dean, two really quite amazing contributions from the author and yourself, sir. The question I really have this, that how do we get the United States and Germany to see this as a major problem for both Europe and the United States? How do we approach the United States and Germany to try and change the way they swallow Israel's narrative? And how do we get Israel to sit down at the table?
Thank you. I don't expect much politically from Germany, to be honest. I expect more from the UN Security Council permanent members, who are split by Ukraine, split by many things. And it tends to be a fallout between US, France, UK on the one side and China and Russia on the other, which is quite tragic for the UN system, because that group of 15 are the ultimate real-time guides to what the international community should do. They're split. When Britain absconded from Palestine in 1948, we handed the issue to the UN without much help from us. So it's very clear from what's happening today, with Blinken doing his tour, that the only country today that Israel will listen to is the United States, and even then. The United States has been making it as clear as it can, having, like us, endorsed the fighting, the retaliation, whatever one wants to call it, endorsed it at the level of Biden. Blinken is not trying to undo that, but is trying to say, do it differently. Don't kill as many, what it boils down to. And he's not actually succeeded in that yet. So, coming back to your question, who can influence Israel? Israelis, clearly. They're in that traumatic phase at the moment where not much is getting through, and I'm told their TV, state TV, is not showing what we see. That's a problem. There are these elements in the Netanyahu government who I think shouldn't be there. They're not the only problem, but they're a big problem in the West Bank. They're not in the kitchen cabinet that's running the war. Can the US, with others, and often we're accused of being the poodle of the US, maybe we can be a little bit more advisory than a poodle usually is in this matter. Can those who have some sway with Israel persuade it that this way is the wrong way, that the best way to get there, maybe 100 hostages out, including 2 Brits, is with a humanitarian ceasefire now and negotiation? And a difficult point, which Peter rightly alluded to, Hamas is not going away. Maybe those people in the tunnels will die. That is the aim. That's not the end of Hamas. Actually, their death becomes martyrdom and so on. How do we get that through? I'm not sure how we get it through. I think we have to hope, we all need hope. I think we have to hope that Cameron and Blinken and the French, maybe even quietly the Germans, although I rather doubt it because of their guilt complex about the Holocaust, can say to Israel, it's time to stop. There's a better way. And I come back to my point, sorry to repeat it, but I come back to my point. The thesis from Netanyahu that you can forget about rights of Palestinians, just keep them down, and everything will be okay, with the occasional hiccup, has been disproved. That at least is true. Getting from there to say, okay, maybe we have to share security, not have a monopoly, which doesn't work. I don't know how. Maybe I wouldn't be sitting here if I had that power. I don't know how, but I know that that's the right thing to try for.
Yeah, just a reminder, if we could keep questions quite succinct. This lady there. Yeah.
Oh, hello all. I would like to ask Vincent a hypothetical question. If what is happening in Gaza at the moment was a natural disaster, say for example flooding or earthquake, would the world not relocate the Gazan to somewhere safe until it has been sorted and safe enough for them to live? That's question number one. Question number two, as a former refugee, I know when I had to flee as a state of emergency, I didn't have choices of whether I would stay there or I would flee to a land I don't like or prefer, okay? So have the Gazan at the moment who are in a terrible crisis situation, have they been asked, like mothers with children sleeping in the cold and outside, have they been given the choice of whether they would rather endure that or they could be relocated?
If this was a natural disaster, there would be free access by the international aid agencies. This is a man-made disaster, and for reasons that have partly to do with the prosecution of the war, there is not free access. For the first 2 weeks, no access. Starvation, what the Defense Minister of Israel called a total siege, complete siege. Since then, a trickle, inadequate. So, if this was a natural disaster, the outlook and the methodology and the outcome would be completely different. If I was in the situation that my wife and children and grandchildren were huddled together under a piece of plastic in Rafah, I'd want to be the other side. Because nowhere is safe. Why is nowhere safe? Nowhere is safe because of the method that Israel is using to prosecute this war. There was talk of a safe area called Al-Mawasi. I don't know if you saw Question Time last week. I caught a snippet from the CEO of Oxfam talking about this place. 1 million people are instructed to go to Al-Mawasi, which is the size of Heathrow Airport, with no water, no food, no tents, nothing. It isn't a safe area. 14 people were bombed there and killed not long ago. Can this tragedy be ended by the mass removal of the Palestinian people from Gaza? It needs to be mass. There are 2 million there, at least half of them starving. Whatever happens, there needs to be a huge humanitarian response now. It is hindered primarily by the danger to the humanitarian workers of re-engaging in Palestine, in Gaza. I mentioned the more than 140 killed from UNRWA. So, to try and finish answering your question, it isn't for me to tell that family in Rafah what to do. But I think more than two-thirds of the people in Gaza now are the children of refugees from 1948 who come from Ashkelon or other parts of what is now Israel. And one of the fears which is being added to by those Jewish supremacists I mentioned is that if there is mass movement out of Gaza, say into Sinai, where there is nothing, it's a desert, it's why there's nobody there, into Sinai, they will not be allowed back. And they don't want to do that. So they're torn. And I come back to the man-made nature of this tragedy. There is a different way. There has to be a different way than what looks like retaliation on an indiscriminate scale by a powerful state.
We have got time for one very quick question, if that's possible. If we could be quite brief, and then perhaps quite a brief answer as well.
I'll do my best.
Yep, good.
I'd like to just move to the political arena for a moment. As long as I can recall, Britain and the UN have maintained two fictions. One is that Israel and Palestinian could negotiate a settlement when one is an occupying power and the other is the occupied, so the power imbalance is impossible. And secondly, that a two-state solution is possible, when we all know, and we have known for years, that Israel has set up settlements in such a way that it's not possible to have two-state solution. Would you like to consider what sort of solution we might ever be able to come up with, and who should do it?
Yeah. Okay, you said a short answer. I think I abdicate. But first of all, on negotiation. There have been negotiations which have failed, but which were real. between Israelis and Palestinians, engineered by the US. I do not believe that the US on its own is a reliable, honest broker. I don't think the UK, historically, on its own is a reliable, honest broker either. We have to look around a bit. I come back to the UN Security Council. I come back to involving Russia. I come back to involving the players, including the Arab neighbors. I would imagine the people who care most today about peace in Gaza are the Egyptians and the Jordanians, outside the Palestinians themselves. They matter. They have peace treaties with Israel, which they want to maintain. Saudi Arabia has the potential to normalize with Israel and wants to, but cannot do so while thousands of Palestinians are being killed, and cannot do so while access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque is limited. So, can there be negotiation? The opposite of negotiation is imposition. I don't see a state or a collection of states willing today to impose a solution on Israel. And as an ex-diplomat, you try and work in the realm of the possible rather than the ideal, because that's where we live, is in the possible. I believe in negotiation. There have to be sticks as well as carrots. Israel has had many carrots. It's a surfeit of carrots. No sticks. That's the impunity point that Peter made. Two-state solution. I have difficulty in believing that the people who won a war in 48, again in 67, and didn't lose in 73, are going to concede power over the entirety of Mandate Palestine. I do not conceive of it. So the one-state solution with equal rights, leading to an Arab majority, I do not think is possible. So where does that leave me? In a bit of a pickle, but trying to persuade myself and our government and anybody who will listen that self-determination for the Palestinian people, genuine, including self-policing, self-customing, self-control, not external control, is the best way to generate peace for Israel and dignity for Palestinians. What to do with 750,000 settlers, I don't know. They are not, in the bulk order, going to go home. Home being the original Israel. I don't know. But I think we should try. And that means negotiation with sticks. Now, getting to the sticks when it comes to Biden in an election year, with Trump harumphing around, is not easy. So you have to come back to reason. What is reasonable? It is reasonable to think that when the trauma diminishes in Israel, enough people might say, we have to build towards mutual security rather than individually imposed security. That could be a long time, but I think we have to try.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Peter. I read Peter's book in draft, and what an amazing piece of research it is. And your telling comment this evening, a truth is an elusive quarry for the historian pursuing this subject. So why don't we start with you, Sir Vincent, and then let Peter perhaps sum up at the end. So, Sir Vincent, any final comments that you'd like to make?
I'll be brief, because it's good that you're all here. That's important. It's good that our colleagues are watching from their homes. Do we have power? I think we do. We live in a faulty democracy. This year, we have an opportunity to say something to our political leaders. We do that every 5 years. I think that this is an opportunity, and I don't want to wait for the general election, whenever Mr. Sunak chooses it, to see change. What can the change be? The change can be more clarity from our political leaders, be they in government or expecting it, hoping for it. What would they do? They talk about two states, Gillian's point. They talk about two states. How do they see us getting there? And I don't want the discourse to be influenced by the propaganda that is coming our way, both from Hamas in a small way and from Israel in a big way. A war is being fought, and trying to influence the minds of the world is part of the war. It's being done. I don't want those who have those axes to grind to dictate what I think. I think we should continue, if we do, to believe in the rule of law. We should continue to argue for humanity over brutality. And we should be saying this carnage must stop.
Thank you very much, Sir Vincent. Peter, what would you like to say in conclusion?
I think I've really said enough, but I'd say however hopeless any or all of us feel, every one of us can do something. Every one of us can do something. None of us is completely helpless. Every raindrop on the mountain counts. Every raindrop counts. I think one issue that, one unassailable issue in this complex, volcanic, contentious issue, I think in the 21st century, is the question of equal rights. Equal rights. I'll stop there, I think.
Yeah, quickly.
Just to let you know that in the months ahead, at the Balfour Project, we'll be holding a number of webinars, and I think, as Sir Vincent mentioned, we'll have a conference in May. So do look at the site, do register to join the webinars. If you can't join them live, they're nearly all recorded. So please, look at the ones we're holding.
Can I add one sentence? Not to detain you, but on the 16th of January, Mike reminds me, on the 16th of January at 3 o'clock, there is a 1-hour webinar about Jerusalem and Gaza, conducted by an Israeli left-wing lawyer called Danny Seideman. It's advertised on our website. If anybody needs details, I can share. He monitors the settlements in East Jerusalem and in the rest of the West Bank, He monitors the impact of the occupation on Christians, as well as Muslims, in Palestine. And he has the ear of some in the Biden administration. A couple of weeks ago, he briefed David Cameron on his visit to the region about the settlements. So he's an authority on the subject, and his intentions, he is Jewish and Israeli, his intentions are peaceful coexistence and an end to the occupation of 1967. He's a voice of reason, and he can be listened to at 3 o'clock on the 16th of January, or, as Mike said, at any time on our website afterwards.
I know a number of you didn't get a chance to ask the question you wanted, but I know Peter will be available and others to chat afterwards. Peter is going to be also signing copies of his book, which are available. So please stay around and chat with us. In initiatives of change, we often have moments of quiet and silence. And let's just hold a silence for a moment before we finish. Just hold a silence. Thank you so much for being with us, and stay around, and good night.